Hello and welcome. This is Down to Astro. I'm Chani Nicholas.
I'm Thea Anderson.
And I'm Eliza Robertson.
This is a monthly podcast where we look at what has just happened, what is about to happen, and then we also talk about how we can work with the astrology of the moment. And the last episode we did was right before Eclipse season officially began. Do you remember the date that we recorded on? It was before October 3rd.
Maybe?
Yeah.
So we recorded an episode before October 7th. The first eclipse of the season was October 15th, correct? Not 14th, 15th.
14th.
And 14th, thank you. So the events of October 7th have not been something that we have discussed here, but the last thing that we talked about was how eclipse season will tend to reveal what is in the shadows, reveal what is already there. It will tend to help us to understand what it is we need to grapple with. And generally, I think you can correct me if either of you disagree, but eclipse season brings up our most difficult issues quite often. And they do act as pivotal moments. They happen twice a year. So just to say a couple of things, none of us here ever want to astrologize catastrophe and horror and evil because it exists in and of itself. It's not that the astrology makes something happen, and none of us believe that either. But what we do talk about a lot on this show and on the Chani app is that there is a mirror in the sky that is giving us information. And what we do as astrologers is we look at that reflection and then we look and see what's happening here on Earth. And to go through and to be in currently, we're recording this on November 9th. So we're currently in this active catastrophe. We are in an active crisis. We are in an active genocide. And it is beyond words, the horror and the grief and the complete and utter devastation. It isn't something that we can do justice to here on this podcast. But I wanted to take a minute to frame it somewhat because a couple of days before October 7th, Mars, the planet of war and the planet of aggression and sometimes violence, but also courage and energy and valor, was in the sign where it struggles, one of the signs it struggles the most in, Libra. And Libra is a sign that's all about justice and peace and equality. And as Mars was traveling through that sign, which is where we would have the first eclipse on October 15th, Mars went over the South Node. And the South Node is a place of emptying out and sometimes loss, sometimes purification, sometimes release. And the fact that the South Node entered into Libra, again, the sign of equality and justice and peace, harmony, whatever that might be, relationships, consensus. It entered there in July. And Mars crossing over the South Node was a huge red flag to me, I think to both of you as well. And it happened just before, again, a couple days before October 7th. And then the eclipse happened, within a week of that, again, around the South Node. And this is the first of a series of eclipses that we're having here with the South Node in Libra. And so the three of us talked a lot months and months ago, even last year, about if the South Node in Libra was going to be a decrease in consensus or a decrease in peace or a decrease in what might be considered justice. And because there is this notion of what consensus may be or may not be, we are in a global moment right now because of what is happening in Gaza, because of what is happening to Palestinian people, because of what happened in terms of the events of October 7th, because of what happened to Israelis on that day. We're in this global conversation about the origins of why that is happening, what justice is and isn't, what peace is and isn't, what liberation is and isn't. And I'm not here to offer any simple solutions, just to say that this moment is devastating and heartbreaking. And on a personal level, in terms of the eclipses having just happened here, there is this like deep reckoning that I think a lot of folks are doing, especially Jews, especially American Jews. That's my position. I am a queer Jewish woman. I'm American. I'm Canadian. I have been indoctrinated with Zionism since I was born, not even because anybody specifically was in my family. It's just that it is the air we breathe. It is the water we drink. It is the thing that is connected to one's Judaism. At least that's been my experience and the experience of so many Jews that I know, especially again in America. And so there have been mass protests around the world. It's been really heartening for me to see so many American Jews stand up for a ceasefire. We know that in this moment that what Palestinian activists are calling for us to support in is a ceasefire. And I think that if we're going to talk astrologically, to have, Mars is now in Scorpio as we're talking, but to have this be the call out around the world, ceasefire, from an event that happened during Mars's transit over the South Node and through Libra, then to have this eclipse in Libra is quite striking. And then after the eclipse in Libra, on the 28th of October, we had an eclipse in Taurus near the North Node, which is now currently in Aries. But that was the last eclipse in Taurus that we will have near the North Node for a couple of decades. And Eliza, you pulled up the chart of 1948 and realized that around that time of the Nakba, of the war, that the eclipse in Taurus had just happened or was about to happen?
It had happened 5 days prior. So I believe the eclipse happened on May 8th or 9th, depending on your time zone. And the war started. One of the times I found for when the war officially started was when the British ended their mandate. I'm using some air quotes here, but their Palestinian mandate. That was around midnight on May 14th. And then the war started the next day. But so 5 days after the eclipse in Taurus. North Node eclipse in Taurus as well.
Yeah, right. I noticed that the sun in that chart, the where the sun was in the sky at that time, is being transited by Uranus right now. So Uranus is a planet of upheaval and breakthroughs and loud destruction and a feeling of something being kind of torn apart often. That's my little, what I wanted to say about this moment. It was hard as it was happening, Eliza and Thea and I struggled to even consider if we wanted to do a podcast like this, because again, we always want to be sensitive to what's happening. And as we were sorting through our feelings and world events were happening, we thought it was still really important to frame that. Do either of you want to add anything to the framing of eclipse season? What is happening? What happened during it? What is still active and happening?
One detail that also struck me, you had mentioned that Mars was in a really challenging condition because it was in its sign of detriment, Libra, one of its signs of detriment. And it was joining the South Node, which was initiating this release. But the other thing to consider is that Venus, the planet who ruled both of the October eclipses, was also in a really challenging condition because it was in its sign of detriment, or rather fall, in Virgo. So, and with the North Node also in Aries, which is ruled by Mars, which was in this terrible condition at least in early October. That's since changed, but in early October, the overwhelming message for me with that is there was just no help. Like none, when a planet is in a sign where it doesn't traditionally fare well, we can sometimes experience the worst side of that planet. We just have less support for it to be constructively channeled, I would say. That's how I can treat that anyway. So I feel with just where the ruler of the eclipses, the Libra eclipse and the Taurus eclipse were both ruled by Venus, and Venus was in a difficult place until just, yesterday? Venus just moved into Libra, which is the sign that it rules, one of the signs it rules. So maybe that's going to be, a hopeful,
Well,
crossing your fingers.
Yeah, and not. We can talk about this in a second. But what did happen is the SAG-AFTRA strike ended, and it's something that we talked about. But Thea, I wanted to hear from you as well, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, thank you for framing the moment. One of the things that I'm also thinking about is how Mars was opposing that Taurus eclipse because we didn't get to speak on it much last time.
Yeah.
And so once Mars moved into Scorpio and was opposing the full moon eclipse in Taurus, it really had like a Martian feel to it, even though I was at first focused in the whole Taurus of it, and it being the last one in Taurus, 20 years, and Uranus being there. And now what the thread that I'm sort of pulling out, and again, don't want to astrologize anything, but is the amount of protests, the amount of fed upness, and the amount of like, fuck this narrative, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
And like how that's kind of a thread that feels like it's really coming out.
Yeah.
Especially after that eclipse. The amount of,
It's like there's eclipses do this thing where it's like the thing that's always there, it's always in the shadow, that all of a sudden can get let out. And we were talking about this as well, is that the 2020 uprisings here after the death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests, uprisings, etc., happened during an eclipse season as well. It was in Gemini, but it was during a Venus retrograde too. But it was like that. It's like, this is always here. This is not new. This is not just something that all of a sudden occurred. This is ancient. Unfortunately, this is hundreds of years old. White supremacy is so deeply embedded in everything. And then it was this explosion of talking about it and having it enter into a mainstream conversation. And certainly Palestine and Palestinian liberation is something that has always been relegated. It's always pushed out because of the threat of being called anti-Semitic in the face of saying that Palestinians should be free and should have access to their human rights and to all of the things that every human on this earth should have access to. And the conflation of those two things and the shadowiness of that is also, you can't go on any social media channel without engaging in it, and from whatever perspective you're engaging in it with. But it is one of those moments where, again, this has been 75 years. And I just want to say, like, that's a short period of time. Jews and Arabs did not, this is a new conflict. It's man-made. It's made by England, the UK. It's made by America. This is not something that was essential to us before this. This is really, really recent. This was created. This can be dismantled, I believe. This can be something that we can have a different experience than this. And Eliza, I just want to say that last year, when we were looking at 2023's astrology, you kept saying, oof, I don't like October, November when Mars is opposing Jupiter. Like and Pluto, you kept bringing it back to that. And I was like, I don't know, will it be that bad? You were right. It's worse than anybody thought. But I just want to give you props for knowing, for seeing it. What were you, was it just the Mars opposition of it all? What were you really kind of thinking about and the eclipse?
It was the double whammy of having this eclipse on the same day that Mars opposed Jupiter.
Yeah.
It just felt I remember the image that came to mind. And obviously, when we're framing this a year out, we don't want to terrify people. Even if I'm unnerved by the astrology, I might text you too. But we're going to try and frame it in the most constructive light possible. And so one of the themes that came to mind was just this idea of competition. And one aspect that I thought of as you were just speaking, Chani, to me, one of the many harrowing facts of this war and all of the devastating, the crisis that's unfolding right now, is this sense of competition with our respective traumas and our respective, and not just competition, because that sounds gratuitous, but feeling deeply, deeply, deeply threatened by the sense that by any show of support for another person's trauma. And I mean that kind of on both ways, because I don't know, I try and not spend lots of time on social media just for my own sanity and mental health. But so I actually don't know how much this is being talked about, but I can imagine that there is also an uptick of anti-Semitism right now at the same time.
Anti-Islamophobia,
all of it,
racism, anti-Semitism, all of it. It all feeds into the power structures that want us fighting, that want division, that want power, that want us all, just picking each other apart on the internet, instead of focusing on the fact that it's not about nobody in these positions of power cares about like they want the land, they want the power, they want the ways in which they can divide us and therefore conquer and control us. And this is something that's obviously going to roll into 2024 and elections. And so yes. And this false binary that Jews can't be safe unless Palestinians are genocided, and that if Palestinians aren't kept in an open air prison, Jews aren't safe. That is false. That is a created myth. That is racist. That is a disgusting, evil trope that, again, is something that we're having these big mass conversations about, which is shadowy material. So I keep relating it to the eclipse, but also we're talking about, now Mars has gone from being in detriment, being in exile, to being superpowered in Scorpio. And we're also having mass conversations about the fact that this is not a war. This is a genocide. Palestinians do not have the arsenal of weapons, very Mars conversation, to fight a war, quote unquote, that this is not what this is. And so all of these conversations about what war is and what it isn't is also happening as Mars is in Scorpio and making its way through.
I mean, there's so many places to go, just in terms of even you talking about the power structure and how Pluto's back in late Capricorn. And I was just thinking about that old way. It feels like it's crumbling. That sort of territorial division, made up borders, fences, gates, and just really seeing like, if I were to put it on the Pluto Capricorn, Pluto going back in and out of Capricorn and back into Aquarius, like with it being in the sign of cardinal Earth, it does feel like there's just that last gasp of like, no, we're going to divide people up like this way and get for power, for structures, for money, for resources, and keep everyone in this narrative that is old. But what I'm sensing at the same time, though, is that like the youth, I sound really old right now, the youth, the young kids who are in school, who are going to walk out of classrooms, who are on social media, I feel that tension and to really want to turn over the narrative. So it could be that like once, you could follow it with Pluto by next January when Pluto goes back into Aquarius to see what the shift is in terms of sort of the white supremacist, like colonial power back to like more of something that puts the power in the collective, in our organizing, in our grassroots campaigns, in spreading the word. So I'd be interested also to follow that.
Yeah. I was thinking about how when Queen Elizabeth passed, it wasn't during the Taurus eclipse, but it was like a month or two before. I don't know if it was, I felt like there was something Taurian going on. She was a Taurus. The monarchy is very Taurian because a lot of people in it are or have significant placements in Taurus. It's land grabs literally all over the world. So that also feels like Taurian in terms of land and Taurus. But when she passed, we had conversations about colonization en masse that I also felt like we didn't ever have. And now with the last eclipse in Taurus, we are able to name what colonization is immediately on a kind of grand scale, which unfortunately is a new ability, I think, for us to be able to have these conversations right away because of the education that, the internet and our kind of mass conversations have been able to grant us. Not to mention the decades and decades and decades of work by activists and academics and folks that have been in this movement. But do either of you remember anything about that or have any connection to that? I remember us having conversations.
Talking about the royals.
Yeah.
I feel like they also have a lot of people in that family were born around eclipses or have eclipses prominent in their chart. That's what I remember.
And I think they're having the kind of like the beginning of England's slave trade is having its Pluto return with this late degree Pluto in Capricorn. I do believe. I think that's part of it. I did research on that. Yeah. So it's like because that is like the original colonial template and power of this kind of colonization. Of course, people have colonized, for many thousands of years, but not in this kind of way where it's like wiping out an entire people and replacing that people with another people and just like putting on top of, someone's culture, another.
I mean, it's like to live in a country that has that inheritance is like living in a haunted house. Like you're on top of a whole people that was there and had a way of living. And that has to be like reckoned with. And I feel like we're definitely in that moment.
Yeah. Okay. So if we're going to look at the current astrology, and if we're going to keep talking about Mars, because the most, like impressive or interesting or rare piece of astrology that's coming up is the Mars cazimi. Do either one of you want to talk about what that is and why this one is rare?
Well, maybe we should just define cazimi first. So a cazimi is any conjunction between the sun and another planet. So actually we experience a cazimi every month with the new moon. That's what a new moon is. It's when the sun and the moon come together. And just like in a new moon, astrologers often interpret cazimis as the beginning of a new cycle for that planet. So for a Mars cazimi, it's going to be planting and initiating and seeding themes related to the planet Mars, which Chani laid out at the beginning of this episode. You mentioned courage, valor. Those are some of the more positive traits. Also aggression, also war, conflict, and so on. This cazimi is extra noteworthy because it's happening in Scorpio, which is Mars's home, Mars's water home. So Mars is, in any case, very powerful here. And a cazimi is considered a really auspicious moment. So I forgot to mention that. It's this beginning of a new cycle, but astrologers for millennia, or at least centuries, have also interpreted it as this very powerful, potent moment. I would say not necessarily pleasant in the moment. Like the metaphor I always like to use is, the way you purify a needle by hovering it through a flame before you say pierce your ears in the 90s. Like it's not necessarily going to feel good, but it is a way of burning off any impurities. And from there, there's, the potential to then gather your strength and your courage. But Thea, you had shared like a really striking quote from Abu Mashar. Do you want to go into that?
I think it's interesting to see the different astrologers' take on how auspicious a cazimi is. And Abu Mashar, so he's a 9th century Arabic astrologer, and he wrote, "Some people say that when a star is in the heart of the sun, it becomes stronger. Nevertheless, I say that in that moment, the star is similar to a man who purifies himself and who therefore does not have strength in that purification. But he regains his health afterwards." And so I think we're both like kind of focusing on that renewal portion of it. And that's something that even if it's an intense purification, like by sitting, anytime you sit in the throne with the king or with the sovereign, it could be very intense. It could be blinding. It could be sort of really overwhelming. But then there's a new cycle that's initiated. And we're talking about the planet's synodic cycle. So it's everybody kind of knows, like, how planets move through the zodiac and that sort of thing. But like with planets, their relationship to where the sun is like what we're talking about here. And that when a Mars cazimi happens, unlike some of the inferior or interior planets like Mercury and Venus, Mars is in direct motion. So we get that cazimi. It's moving in direct motion. It's happening every 2 years. It's hidden. We can't see it in the sky, but it's a renewal moment. And so, yeah, that's what's happening right now in the sign of its fixed water home, how you were saying. So in Scorpio, it's kind of hovering near the sun right now. Mars is. And so that's sort of a weakening point, although some astrologers may say, well, it's okay because it's in its sign that it rules. But it's that moment that happens on November 17th actually kind of lasts, I think we would say, for a couple days of that cazimi moment that we'll start to feel the purification moment around the cazimi.
And Thea, do you want to talk about the last time this happened and what was going on in the world? Because I also felt like this was really striking in terms of the conversations that we're having, in terms of the words that we're using to describe a situation.
Yeah, so the last time that we had a Mars cazimi in the sign of Scorpio was November 8th, 1991. So there were some striking similarities that, for me as an astrologer, really paralleled a lot of what we're talking about here. The sort of strategic moment, the sort of addressing conflict in that scorpionic kind of way. And so part of it is that it felt in 1991, I'll talk about one thing, is that at this moment in time, Nelson Mandela has been released from prisoner after nearly 3 decades of being a political prisoner in South Africa for trying to liberate people who were oppressed under apartheid, so Black people. But it had a whole gradated color scale. and basically apartheid regime from about 1948, right, until 93, 94, when Nelson Mandela becomes the first Black South African president, is a regime that just granted power to a select few white people, okay, in an African country. And so when he's out of prison, he starts doing work with the current president at that time. And a lot of this is he becomes president of the ANC. He starts having negotiations with the current power structure, and also sometimes being criticized, like, you're playing this game, you're not going to win. You need to just take this course of action. But he really, in the months of 1991, so from September to December, basically gathered consensus, had these sort of negotiations, and held conferences that began to position him to eventually become the president of South Africa. So it was really stunning to me that cazimi happened in that moment. And if we think about apartheid and what that is, it's separation for the purpose of power. And so that was really striking and also emotional for me, to be honest, to see the ways that struggle, the way that it really, to see like how people can address struggle, but still use that sort of Mars cazimi to seed a moment that maybe and gather their courage and position themselves for the good fight in that way.
Thank you. So beautiful research. And also for us to be using the word apartheid in this moment now, to be very clear about the conditions that Palestinians have been living in for 75 years under the state-sanctioned violence of Israel as a state. So when I am talking about this, I'm not talking about Jews. I'm talking about Israel. I'm talking about the state. And for anybody who wants to like mince my words and try to get me in a position where you're going to say that I'm promoting anti-Semitism, I'm not. And I think that this Mars cazimi is one of those moments for us to have that kind of clarity. And I was talking to an activist yesterday, and she was talking about strength building and how necessary strength building is at this moment. And I think that that is what this cazimi is looking like for me. It's looking like, how do we do practices long-term that are strength building? Because nothing that we want to achieve in terms of liberation is going to come easily. And nothing that we want to achieve in terms of trying to negotiate and our collective liberation, our collective freedom with these massive systems of power that are so entrenched in everything that we do is going to come easily. So what is it that we need to do both in the short term in terms of ceasefire and also long term in terms of, all of the things that we might want to achieve, not only in our lifetime, but many lifetimes forward, right? Like, how can we also not just think about our own needs, but also the needs of our, future generations?
I think the only thing that comes to mind is, so the reason why we're talking about these behind the scenes activity with Scorpio is that it unlike Aries, which is the other sign that Mars rules, Scorpio takes that power of Mars and makes it subterranean in some way. So it's more about strategy and long-term tactics and savvy rather than like brute force or conflict. And to me, the other side of that also is not everything that we do has to be visible or performed. Like, I think that we can do a lot. I think people do a lot in their homes or in their communities, or, I've been reflecting on this because this isn't the first, and you both might have different opinions on this, but this isn't the first collective moment where there's been a pressure, I think, to speak out. And I do think that there is a lot of merit and a lot of courage, and there is an imperative to do that, especially for certain people in certain positions. And at the same time, I know that you can do a lot of work by actually having a heartfelt conversation that's not recorded anywhere. That's just you, person to person, with, you know, with your sibling, with your spouse, with your friend, whoever, or, you know, the way, what you're teaching kids that you're raising or that you have relationship with, or like all of the ways that we can create activism in our lives, even if it doesn't always match the images. And I'm not trying to in any way diminish also the more clear-cut forms of activism. I just think not everything has to happen front and center. I think that there can be a lot that we do on a subterranean level and a lot that we do behind the scenes, whatever that means for each person.
Yeah. And we need all of it. All the levels, all the different ways of showing up, all the different skills, all the different talents, the extroversion, the introversion, the middle of that.
That was really beautiful. Thinking about the quietness of Mars and Scorpio, but it's still very incredibly potent. And the opposition to Uranus just feels like one of the ways that you could step into that moment is to flip over things that don't work for you, to sort of like break with a narrative or question things, and to really, if we look at the level of protests that were happening, like so last weekend, it was incredible to witness, to be a part of. And I think that that's also one way that it's sort of manifesting on that grand scale. And also the fixed sign of, you know, the fact that this is happening in fixed signs means like there's an endurance quality to it. So I think of an endurance of like running a marathon, that we don't have to come out the gate with everything at once. We can sort of like really pace ourselves and think about, we want to take action that's long lasting and has impact. And so that's another way to kind of meditate on that or lean into that.
Yeah. So I want to just clarify one thing that you said. So what's going to happen this weekend is Mars is going to make an opposition to Uranus.
Yes.
Right before it makes the conjunction with the sun. And so Mars opposing Uranus, what's the exact date? Do either of you have that? Mars opposing Uranus is
I think it's the 11th.
The 11th, so it's within.
I think.
So we're recording this on the 9th. So over the course of this weekend, it's very turbulent. It's very much about breaking with norms. It's very much, it's very loud. I think that's probably what I talked a lot about in the recordings for this week, is how loud and kind of in your face, but it's also Mars and Scorpio. So it's deep, and it's things that are, again, subterranean, coming maybe to the surface or breaking through, since Uranus has a tendency to kind of break ground, especially in Taurus. And then by the time it gets to the 17th, when Mars and the sun come together, it's in a different kind of situation. It carries that flavor with it, but it's also trining Neptune, which is very ideal. It's about an idealistic way to take action. It's like, what is the deep, subterranean, long-lasting new beginning we can take that is moving steadily towards an ideal, towards what some might call a fantasy, but what we know could actually be a reality. And then it's sitting in a whole sign sextile to Saturn, which is supportive in terms of the long-lasting. And so there's the nature of the Mars cazimi in and of itself, and how rare it is because it's happening in Scorpio, and that it won't happen again in Scorpio for like 3 decades or so, give or take a couple of years. And then it's in this very caustic and volatile opposition to Uranus. So we know that we're living in it, we're feeling it, but something's got to give, and something's breaking through, and it's really hard stuff. Scorpio deals with the horrors of life. Scorpio deals with the underbelly of things. Scorpio's like, cute that you want to be all love and light, but this is the shit and the grime and the dirt and the rotting of what's just underneath the surface. It doesn't let us skirt over the surface like other signs might want us to. So it's like grappling with this really deep thing, and that the opposition to Uranus is making it loud. And then by the time it gets to the cazimi, there is this supportive situation with Neptune that I think is positive because of how deeply Scorpio grapples with the real horror and tough stuff of life, that to have that supportive trine to Neptune can feel, or I hope it reads as something that does maybe even unify, because Uranus will tend to separate and break apart, and the Neptune of it all will hopefully is a signal that maybe there's some kind of Mars type of unity, which isn't necessarily like a Venus type of unity. So it's edgy still. It's going to be pointed. It's going to be specific in what it's going after, but it is connected to something that I'm hoping does kind of gather perhaps more people.
No, I like it. We need it. We need ideals. We need to work towards ideals. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And I also want that with Venus now being in Libra, it does feel like there is sort of some good repair work around justice and bringing in a sense. It's interesting with it being co-present with the South Node. Like, I want to see what happens, but I'm hopeful also because of that. Mm-hmm. And is it okay if I talk about U.S. politics for a second?
Please,
because we just had an election.
Yes.
And what's really stunning is that, so we had an election on Tuesday. Tuesday night, I think, Venus entered Libra. And I felt hopeful, at least in some of the issues, one of them being abortion. And so if we think of Venus ruling femmes, reproductive issues, and that even in this kind of paradigm we're living in the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, we still have states that have risen up and said no, like we want to protect abortion, even though it got put on the ballot to like help restrict it further. People showed up, and it felt very Venusian to me, like a way to sort of even out that.
It was a lovely piece of good news.
Yeah. I'll take it.
Yeah. Yes. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, that it's stunning that, we talked in our last episode, maybe both of them, but at least, one of them, where, Venus retrograde was happening during the strikes, and how rare it was that SAG-AFTRA and WGA were striking at the same time, and how that grinded the industry to a halt. And Venus is a planet of women, femmes, LGBTQ folks, but also artists. And the moment that Venus moves back into Libra, the SAG-AFTRA strike ends. So that's stunning. I also heard somebody say on social media somewhere, I'm sorry, I can't remember who, but said like, okay, so we're in this giant, global conflict, and all of a sudden we get the entertainment industry back. Like, is that a coincidence, or, is it a distraction thing? But we also want all of our friends and loved ones who are in that industry to be able to work again. So it'll be interesting to see how that industry kind of rolls out after the strikes. And I'm with you, Thea, like I'm hoping deeply that some kind of consensus is being mirrored in the sky and here on Earth in terms of what people need to be able to thrive and survive on the planet.
I just want to really highlight what you've said, because it is so striking for the astro nerds listening to this. It's so striking that the WGA strike, so the writer's strike, ended when Mercury was in its home trining Jupiter, which is the greater benefic, a helper. Mercury rules writing, among other things. And then it's, the performer's strike ends as the performer of the solar system, one of them, but Venus ruling artists, as you mentioned, enters its sign of domicile. It's just it's on the nose.
Yeah. Wild.
But I just wanted to loop back around to the Neptune piece, because you mentioned idealism, but I think the other boon of Neptune, I think hard aspects to Neptune, I'm tremendously wary of, but supportive ones, as this cazimi will have, it's a trine, which is a supportive aspect. To me, the word that comes to mind also is compassion, and just remembering the ways in which we're not separate, which is medicine that Mars needs, because Mars, one of the traditional links with Mars is separating. That's what Mars does. That's its fundamental drive, is cutting and separating. But Neptune does, I think, offer a bit more of a glue and a bond, and it ebbs away at the edges between us, so that we see how we're all interconnected. And if we let one group, if we let violence come to one group, that is not helping anybody.
Right.
Like, again, the haunted house metaphor is sticking with me, Thea, but that's not a foundation upon which you want to build a home or a people, a humanity.
Yeah, a humanity. Yes, and maybe even Neptune could be a supportive aspect from Neptune could be thought of as reminding us, like you say, of compassion, but also of our humanity, because it feels like in this moment where 10,000, at this time where we're recording, 10,000 Palestinians have been murdered, 4,000 children, that it's like literally, where is the humanity? How is this happening? This is a war crime. Gazans don't have water, food, medical supplies, bombings of hospitals, children, women, grown adults, everybody being operated on without painkillers or anesthetics or the cleaning supplies and electricity. Like, it's, at times. And so this is a catastrophe beyond. And so I am also hoping that is something that is mirroring a moment where perhaps we're en masse choosing humanity, our own humanity, for the sake of being able. I mean, it's like it's so the compactness of this devastation and this horror is, I don't think, like anything we've had to witness on our phones, and obviously people there are witnessing it in a real time in such a way. It's only been 31 days, and already the mounting horrors and the mounting complications, and where is this going? Feeling that everybody's left with. And of course, we're not going to hang things on astrology. We all have to. That has to be like a human decision to choose humanity and our own and each other's over everything else. But fingers crossed that is something somewhat of a turning point. I'm not sure. I don't want to hang too much on it, but we wanted to also, think about what do you say to people when you see a cazimi in somebody's chart?
Ooh, depends on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I do know a couple babies that were born around, I think, the Venus cazimi this summer. So I was very excited for
I tried to get as many of my friends married on that cazimi as possible, but you can only do so much. You know who you are if you're listening to this.
And so, I think of it as sort of a really auspicious intensification of that planet's signification. So, like, if it was Venus, then I'm looking for the Venusian to kind of, especially depending on the sign, but because the one we had this summer was the Venus cazimi in Leo and Sun rules Leo, the sort of like more performative aspect of Venus. And then also too, the ones that I would put the most weight on, if we're thinking Mercury, Venus, or Mars cazimi, I think those are the ones that really kind of stand out to me. Although, Jupiter and Saturn are good too, but I feel like those three, especially like a Mars cazimi in a chart, I didn't know if I've even seen it recently or in a long time. Maybe I need to give more readings. I usually see combustion or like you just missed it.
It's much more common.
But it's still important. Yeah. But it's still pretty stunning. And it's either way, I feel like that planet, especially if it's a Mars. So now my compass Mars is speaking, but it could kind of have like a really important role to play. And it's always interesting to see the way that people do that in their charts. The other thing I will say, this is not your question, but like if a planet's about to station, retrograde or direct is kind of the two things that stand out.
Yeah.
So Chani or Thea, how do people tell if they have a cazimi planet or a combust planet?
That's a good question.
Great question.
Under the beams planet.
There's I think we all agree that there's two different kind of lines of thinking about this. So what you would do is you'd pull up your chart in the Chani app or on chani.com, and you look for your sun, which is the circle with a dot in it, and you see if any other planet is right by it. Mercury will most likely be very close, or Venus will be very close because they travel together. So it's not rare at all to have Mercury and Venus in the same sign as the sun. That conjunction is super common. But if any planet is within, I go by 1 degree. So if any planet is within 1 degree of your sun, so you have to look at the big number and then also the little number next to it. Now, there's another qualification that is how many minutes? How many arc minutes?
16 arc minutes.
So that's the strictest definition, that a planet has to be within 16 degrees of the sun in order for it to be considered.
16 minutes. Did you say degrees?
16 minutes. Thank you. The problem...
So there are 60 minutes in 1 degree, just in case anyone's like, what is a minute?
So you're not going to be able to tell the minute on the Chani app, actually, because we don't include the minutes. So you just would have to look and see if the planet was in the same degree as your sun or within 1 degree. So just like if your sun is at 20, then it is another planet at 19 or 20 or 21. And technically, that could still not be considered a cazimi because we're not giving you the minutes. So I don't know if this is good homework to give people to go look at their chart. But if it's within the same degree, if it's the same number as your sun, then you're for sure someone who is born with that planet cazimi. And I made a mistake. I didn't try to get a whole bunch of people married on this cazimi. I was actually thinking about last year's cazimi, the cazimi of
the one
Venus
in Libra.
In Libra.
That's when you would...
Yeah, I was like, wait, this one in Leo was actually kind of chaotic because of Uranus. So I just want to clarify my earlier statement. I tried to get y'all married with the Venus Libra cazimi, but you didn't listen.
Yeah, the other piece I would add in terms of the natal chart is, so what's the sun in the natal chart? One piece that the sun represents is your life purpose. You know, what you're really drawn to accomplish in this life, or what you're magnetized towards doing in a meaningful way. And so if you have a planet that is cazimi, that the qualities and the themes of that planet is going to infuse your life purpose, probably. So if you have a Venus cazimi natally, you might be drawn towards doing something that involves, it would depend on the sign, but it might involve beauty in some way. Maybe you're an artist, maybe you're a perfume maker, maybe you're a designer, an architect. In certain sign, maybe you would actually be advocating for peace and for diplomacy. If you're a Mars cazimi, you might be an athlete. You might be a chef and like wielding many knives, or, there are different ways that it can show up. So, and I would actually say it's still interesting to me if someone has an outer planet cazimi for that reason, that it's infusing the sun. So if you were born with a Uranus cazimi, so Uranus and your sun together, you're probably going to move through the world with a bit of a higher voltage than others.
Chaos.
And I have met people who literally are more electric, like they zap people more than the average person.
Yeah. I would though argue that when we say combust, it means that the planet is close to the sun, but it's not exactly conjunct it. And so what's the degrees of combustion? 16?
No, it's under the beams is within 15, and then I think
15. But if
and
so
then
it's within
combust, I think it's 8.
7 or 8, yeah.
Yeah. So if a planet's 15 degrees away from your sun, it's actually really special because it would have been a bright morning or evening star. So that's a whole other kind of articulation of how the sky looks when you're born. And this is the last thing I'll say, and then we'll kind of talk about what the Mars cazimi might mean for you and how to think about it. But that I think that when a planet is within like even 2 degrees of your sun, we call it, it's like technically not a great situation because it's like being like, it's being totally overwhelmed with the heat and the fire of the sun and not a purification kind of way. It's like being like super dehydrated, crawling through the desert, reaching the temple, but you're not in the temple yet. You don't have the water yet. You don't have the infusion yet. But I do still think that that planet will infuse that purpose, that person's life purpose. It's just that they have to work with a gnarlier version of it or a more kind of distorted or edgy or kind of like crankier version of it, maybe. I don't know.
That checks.
Yeah. Okay, so look at your chart. See if you have any planet in the same degree as your sun, at least. If you have a planet within a degree of your sun, that might also be cazimi. You might have to talk to an astrologer. Maybe we're going to have to add that to the app in at some future date because we talk about cazimi so much as well. But in terms of this Mars cazimi that's happening on November 17th, technically, but does really last for a couple of days after the Mars and the sun are traveling pretty close together. So it does feel like it's quote unquote good for a couple of days. It's good over that weekend. That, in the readings for the week in your rising sign readings, I talk extensively about it. I've been talking about it for weeks in your readings because I've been trying to get you to look forward to it. And then there's a ritual for the Mars cazimi and journal prompts to help you locate it. You can also read your Mars and Scorpio horoscope to get a better sense of the domain, the house in your chart that it's happening within, and thinking about it as the seeding, the beginning, the initiation of a 2-year cycle for you in that part of your chart that is about strategy. It is about what you can do in secret. It is about what you can do to build strength. You might even say resilience. I would use that word for Scorpio and for especially Mars and Scorpio. And thinking about a little bit more of a long haul kind of trajectory of what you want to win at. What is the thing that you could win at that would be connected to a greater ideal or something that seems like it is going to help you to not feel isolated and alone. I think that trine to Neptune also talks about that, like the disintegration of borders instead of the erection of them.
I just want to add the new moon in Scorpio too. Also feels like it's and I'm sure you've talked about that on Monday's new moon in Scorpio, which is maybe the first non-eclipsed one in 2 years. And so that all that newness in the Scorpio part of your chart feels very like potent to be able to work with.
I mean, I looked at this Mars cazimi and was very excited. With the recent events, I feel a little more like, okay, wait, there's also a lot of gravity.
Yeah.
But ultimately, a cazimi is an auspicious moment, even if we have to push through the discomfort.
Yeah.
Of that as well.
Yeah. Great. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for having this discussion together. We appreciate you. We're going to be back next month, I believe, with a look at 2024's astrology and talking about what we're excited about, what we're wary about, what the strategy is for next year, for all of the things that we might have to work through and confront, and also to hopefully celebrate, goddess willing. So meet us back here then. Until then, take good care of yourselves and each other, and find all those ways to build strength within yourself, your communities, and hopefully also within the world. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.